Hello, I'm Zach Steele. I was a teacher at Pocahontas High School. I actually just recently, like within the last 3 weeks, got a job working at a university. So I just kind of shift gears just a little bit. But I got the opportunity to work at Post Consumer Brands over this last summer. Riley, who you heard from earlier, was also there as well. So one of the great things that I absolutely love about Strive is, we go through and we talk about all these lessons that we did, and I'll talk about one of the ones that I did, but this is not just like a one lesson thing. This is something that constantly I would refer to that whenever I teach algebra too. So whenever we went over a new content, I would say, listen, this is how it was applied in a real world scenario that we used at Post. So I think one of the greatest benefits of Strive was being able to constantly give kids examples of applications for what they're learning in the classroom. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about, if you go to the next slide, about what I did. I'm going to run through real quick kind of what it was like from the teacher perspective. So we went into Strive. They had methods for how you enter. You can't wear outside shoes into the facility, into Post. They took us through and on the first day, and we basically job shadowed several different positions that they have. So if you haven't seen the Post facility in Jonesboro, it's 5 stories high. And I think there's 9 different zones, if I'm remembering correctly, of what they do basically to process the cereal and make the cereal. So we went through, maybe spent about an hour, a little under an hour at different positions throughout the whole place our first day. Then we got to talk with who our supervisor there was going to be. So I was in quality assurance with Mr. Tom Gleason. But I got to observe what we ended up doing was I spent about half a day working for him, and then about half the day going to different positions and observing them for a full half day, so I can get more in depth with different positions of the facility. But what I got to do with quality assurance, they brought me basically a stack of some testing they had to do. So with their quality assurance, they had to go and swab different locations around the facility and test them in their lab for different kinds of bacteria. And so at the time, they had all of, like, I'm telling you, tons and tons of paperwork over all this and forms to fill out. And so basically what I did, I converted all of those digitally onto Excel. And then I basically, using Excel, made a little database of all the forms that they had, so they could go through and find them. And it was actually really interesting because they were going through an audit at the time, and I had all their paperwork while I was putting it in, and so they came over and they're like, "We need to see what swabs we had for this specific location." And I was like, "Oh, I can just pull that up on this Excel that I just made, and it'll show you exactly which forms were for that location instead of having to file through all that different paperwork." So that was really interesting. And then another benefit about seeing how the audit was, for those of you that have gone through audits, tons of just documentation and paperwork. And so teaching math, I'm sure y'all have heard, kids do not like showing their work when it comes to math. And so I got into the habit of, it's not showing your work anymore, it's documenting that you got to the right answer. At Post, if they swapped a location but didn't have the documentation for it, well, they really didn't do it in the eyes of the audit. So I kind of tried to make that connection with students throughout the year. So if you'll go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about what I did. I've got the standard there that I connected this lesson with. I use, for those of you that are teachers, the project-based learning strategy. All right. And so what I did,
1 minute warning.
I went and used Google Sheets, and I made different formulas and hid the formulas so the students couldn't see them. I broke them up into groups, and then from using those formulas, I had basically a table that would automatically plug the numbers into the formula and give the result out. And so the students had to try to determine what the formula was. And of course, there's more than one answer. They didn't have to do the exact formula that I put in, but that was the first part that we did. After that, I had each group create their own formulas using Google Sheets, and then have them put numbers in from their table into that formula, and then they switched to a different group. And so the next group would try to figure out what the formula was that the previous group had made. All right, so that's how I set up the lesson. For the assessment, you can see there from the pre-assessment to the post-assessment, 85% of my students increased at all their score. 79% increased by at least 10%, and 69 increased by at least 25% from the pre to post test. Are there any? I had ran through that really quick, but are there any questions? Pull up the chat.
Can you describe a little bit more about your assessment?
Yes. So you mentioned earlier how sometimes we like to have the tangible results, but then there's also some that are more intangible. I've kind of throughout this year been thinking of it as objective versus subjective answers. And so there was the data that I have right there that comes from, I basically split the test into two parts. I had the objective questions and then the subjective, which the students didn't know that I split it up, but that way I could kind of grade each individually. And so that comes from the objective part. So that's their actual knowledge of the content. The subjective part asks questions, such as like one of the big ones that I liked was, what kind of jobs can implement what you've learned from this lesson. And it went on the post test, it went to just over 90% had an actual legitimate answer for that question, where they can actually list jobs that relate to the content that I was teaching. And so that's how I did the assessment portion of it.
Awesome, thanks. Any questions for Zach?
I have a question. So you have a new role now, Zach. How can your role now kind of play into what you learned in Strive?
I first off, I'm still in contact with a lot of teachers. I'm still in the education field because I'm now working for a university. I work in the financial aid office, and so I'm not so much directly teaching as much anymore. But from what I learned from Post, I learned a lot about their documentation methods. I used a lot of Excel. It's got to see how they run things. And so as I've transitioned to this new job, I've used some of those skills that I learned at Post to bring into here as well. And then also I hopefully would, in the far future, since I have this connection to Strive, maybe possibly having a college aspect added to it as well. Maybe getting professors involved, or even using colleges as kind of how placing teachers with colleges and seeing how different departments in a university operate, because those are positions the kids could apply for as well and see.
I like that. We definitely need to talk more.
Sounds good.